Right, guys, so this is the last lesson in the attachment topic for A level psychology, and it's all about how attachments actually impact us in later life. So, up to now, we've always been looking at how attachments are formed and animal studies into attachment, and is it innate or is it learned, or what happens if we lose an attachment. But actually, the important thing to have a little think about now is once we have our attachment type, how does it go on to affect us as we become toddlers, as we become young children, teenagers, and then later when we start thinking about romantic relationships, and then actually finally as well, how does it affect us when we are parents ourselves? So the little bit of recap that you need to kind of be aware of for this topic is you've got Bowlby on the left there and his internal working model. So if you remember, the internal working model was proposed by Bowlby, and he said that it was a template of future relationships that was based on your primary attachment type or primary attachment caregiver. If you had a good quality attachment with your primary attachment figure, then you're more likely to go on and have good quality attachments later, is the essence of it. And then you've also got Mary Ainsworth with her attachment types. So you had secure, insecure, avoidant, and insecure resistant. Secure being the most common and the most psychologically healthy, avoidant being the one where you don't really show very much emotion in separation, reunion, or stranger anxiety. It's all kept in and not expressed, whereas insecure resistant was the infant that was extremely distressed in the strange situation, extremely anxious, and rejected comfort upon reunion. So, how does the internal working model affect us then in terms of later relationships? So, if you think of the internal working model as the mental representations that we all carry with us of our relationship to our primary caregiver, that includes what we think relationships should be like. So in the future, so if you the relationship that you had with your primary caregiver, you're likely to go on and you're likely to mimic what you learned from that relationship with later relationships as well. So if you had a loving and an affectionate experience, then you are more likely to go and seek out functional relationships and behave functionally within them. By functional, we mean stereotypically normal relationships and healthy relationships. If, however, you had an avoidant experience, then you're more likely to go on and be uninvolved in a relationship later, emotionally unavailable. And if you had a resistant experience, then you can actually turn out to be quite controlling in a relationship. You could go on to be quite argumentative and even hostile in later relationships. So the general rule is that negative experiences in terms of attachment in infancy will result in a struggle to form relationships, and could also lead to people acting and behaving inappropriately within relationships. So people who are avoidant or resistant could actually go on to display avoidant or resistant behaviors towards their partners in later life. So that's how the internal working model can affect it. If we move on now to relationships later in childhood, so this is when you start to form friends in school. Research has been done there. You've got Kearns et al. In 1994, who found that essentially securely attached children form the best quality childhood friends. So this goes back to having had a secure attachment, having a functional attachment, and therefore going on to form functional friendships later on. However, that being said, people with insecure attachments are more likely to have friendship difficulties. Whether that's forming friendships or maintaining friendships or behaving appropriately within those friendships, friendship difficulties will be an issue for insecurely attached infants. Moving on from that, still staying within childhood though, and building on that friendship difficulties for insecure infants. You also had research done by Myron, Wilson, and Smith in 1998. They found by studying 196 different children, ages 7 to 11, they found that actually attachment types can predict bullying. And they found that avoidant children were most likely to be the victims of bullies, and resistant children were more likely to be the bullies. Securely attached children did not have any part in bullying behaviour. And now we move on to romantic relationships in adulthood. Again, very important part of human behaviour. McCarthy, 1999, did some research on that, and it was found that 44 women who were assessed for attachment types, they found that securely attached people had the best adult friendships and the best adult relationships, romantic relationships as well. Whereas resistant and avoidant people had more trouble in that area. So people who were avoidant, they struggled with intimacy, and people who were resistant, they had trouble maintaining relationships and again behaving appropriately within those relationships. Okay, so you've got them there lined up. Securely attached looks happy and everything's going well. Avoidant are afraid or avoid intimacy or have trouble with intimacy, and resistant people actually can't maintain or are less likely to be able to maintain a healthy relationships. One key study that was done by Hazen and Shaver in 1987, they analysed 620 replies to a love quiz. It was split into three sections. Number one, they were assessed on their current or most important relationship. Number two, they were assessed on their general experiences of love. And thirdly, they were assessed on their attachment type. So the results came back, and 56% of people were securely attached, 25% of them were insecure avoidant, and 19% of those were resistant. The results showed that securely attached people had good, long-lasting experiences of relationships. So again, it comes back to that functional relationships, happy, healthy relationships. Whether they ended or didn't, the point was that they were good and long-lasting experiences. Whereas avoidant people, avoidant attachments, they tended to experience a lot of jealousy within a relationship, and they were very, very afraid of intimacy within those relationships as well. So Hazen and Shaver's study showed that the patterns of attachment behaviour are actually reflected in later romantic relationships as well. And then as a final little bit, and this is a bit that kind of we'll all hopefully end up at, and that is, what kind of parent are we going to be? I mean, we all hope that we're going to be good parents, if we want children. We all hope that we're going to be good parents. However, our early attachment experience and our early attachment types can actually make an accurate prediction as to how good a parent we're actually going to be. So Bailey et al. In 2007 actually did some research into whether or not the internal working model would affect somebody's ability to parent. and whether or not attachment types would actually be passed down through the generations. And to do that, he assessed mothers and their children using the strange situation to assess the infant's attachment type. He also assessed the mother's attachment type to their mother using interviews. And he actually found that mothers very often have the same attachment type as their children. So, he learned from that, secure parents will bring up secure children, avoidant parents will bring up avoidant children, and resistant parents will actually bring up resistant children. So attachment types are in fact passed on, or can in fact be passed on from parent to child. Okay, so at that point you can stop the presentation if you want. That's the end of the outline. I'm now going to just go on and do a little bit of the evaluation as well, just in case anybody wants to keep listening. Obviously you can have a little break or something if you want as well. And for anybody who just heard some violent shaking in the background, that was the dog who was just having a good old shake. Okay, here we go. So, evaluations. So, right off the bat, evidence on the importance of the of the internal working model is very inconclusive. Okay, so internal working models predict that there's a continuity between the security of an infant's attachment and that of its later relationships. So essentially, that means that the internal working model predicts that attachment type in infancy is usually the same as the attachment type that characterizes a person's later relationships. However, attachment research is inconclusive on this particular issue. You've got people like McCarthy, who I mentioned earlier, who provide evidence to support the internal working model. However, you've also got people like Zimmerman in 2000 who don't support it. So Zimmerman assessed infants' attachment types and adolescent attachments to parents and found that there was actually very little relationship between infant and adolescent attachment, which is obviously a problem because it's not what we would expect if the internal working model was actually that important in development. So you've got inconclusive evidence to deal with. You then have this issue of validity. So a lot of the research in this area has massive validity issues for two reasons. Number one, you've got self-report techniques that are very regularly used, and number two, you've also got the use of retrospective data. Okay, so most studies don't actually use the strange situation to assess infant-parent attachments, but actually they use interviews and questionnaires instead. And very often the interviews and the questionnaires are actually conducted not in infancy, but they're actually conducted years later. So that poses numerous problems. Number one, self-report techniques in general rely on participants being honest with the researcher, but also having a realistic view of their relationship with their parent or with their own relationship with their partner, which, is difficult to achieve, really. Another problem is that you're asking somebody questions about something that happened years and years and years ago. So this is retrospective data. You're asking them to look back, God knows how many years, and try to remember accurately the nature of their attachment to their parent, for example. Well, that relies on very accurate recollections, and it's not a very valid way of collecting research. I mean, don't get me wrong, sometimes it's the only way of collecting research, but it's still not particularly valid. So the next point, just in case you're interested, there are some very interesting facts about water on there that you should all read, because actually water has been connected with a number of terrible, terrible incidents in the world. So you should all really, really think about whether you really want to be drinking it. This point is all about correlation versus causation, or association versus causation. So where infant attachment type is associated with the quality of later relationships, the implication is that infant attachment types actually causes the attachment later in life, or the quality of the relationship later in life. However, there are obviously alternative explanations for that level of continuity that exists between infant attachment and later relationships. So, for example, a third factor, such as parenting styles, might have had a direct effect on attachment and later relationships. You've also got this idea of temperament as well, the fact that your personality could also have affected your attachment to your parents and could also have affected your relationship later in life. So just because there is an association there doesn't mean that the attachment type actually causes the type of relationship that you have later in life with other people. Okay, so that is a really strong limitation, because it actually goes against Bowlby's view that the internal working model causes the later outcomes. Okay, and then we've got one more for you, and that's this one. So, although it seems likely that infant attachments are influence later relationships, we have to be very clear about the fact that researchers have probably exaggerated the significance of early attachments and the internal working model. So Clark and Clark go on to say that it's all down to probability. Yeah, sure. It's a possibility. And, if you look at the probability, yeah, okay, there's probably a high probability that if you have a bad attachment style as an infant, then you might go on and have a poor relationship with your partners in the future. However, it's not set in stone. People are not always doomed to have bad relationships if they had a poor quality attachment to their primary caregiver. It just means that they have a greater risk of problems, that the probability of them having problems is that little bit higher. Okay, so there's also a further issue that actually, if we start emphasizing the risk, then we actually risk becoming far too pessimistic about people's futures, which is a big problem. We don't want to be doing that. So again, it's not a certainty, it's just based on probability, and actually it's not set in stone, and that's something that we need to be aware of. Okay, so the 4 points that I just talked about there are very, very briefly summed up on that last slide. So you can pause it there if you want and take any notes that you want to take, or obviously you can skip back through the presentation. I hope it's been helpful. Thank you.